Good evening and welcome to the Posthumous Poetry Series Part 21. It's starting to have the similar effects of a long distance flight as we do our poems. It's hard to believe it is 21. But you know, I think we're really on to something that's quite unique and wonderful. And for those who keep checking it out, I'm really appreciative. Nothing like this is happening anywhere else. This is much better than those old back rooms and terrible bars across the country where poets are forced to read for nothing. But anyway, I do digress, and today's poem's about kind of digressing, and this poem is a poem that marks kind of like a landmark in my writing. This is the first poem I wrote when I moved to Henderson, Las Vegas, Nevada. I'd been living in Pittsburgh for about 15 years, being a poet and a known poet, and running a nice nonprofit organization, and that kind of stuff. And of course, working a day job, that kind of stuff, being a real poet. But when I moved to Vegas, I had nothing. I was cut off from all that. I was cut off from my poetry friends. I was cut off from my usual stuff. So the question is, how would I live out there in this new world? How would I conduct myself in the next chapter? And what was the next chapter? Living really just, estranged from the life I had known, And then I began to write when I was out there, and I began to write a kind of poem that I hadn't written before. I didn't intend for it to be written this way. And I think that's a true mark of creativity. You don't really control these things, they kind of happen. And the better gifted artist will allow it to happen, and just try to make the best of it. These poems became longer and they became more meandering, just like my conversation is right now. They were collages. They were musical pieces, in the sense of, not that you're going to see notes or anything, but they were written with John Coltrane in mind, or they were art pieces written with Salvador Dali in mind, or they were, stuff like that, or they were poems. Poems can be anything. Poems can be music. Poems can be art. Poems can be pasta. Poems can be the lunch I had today at India Palace. I mean, there's poetry is like oxygen, so it's everywhere, and poet just finds a way to capture the poetry without killing it and put it in a little poem so people can see it. And so these poems really took on their own life, and I guess it was kind of the fact that no one was going to see them anyway. So my creativity just, kind of freaked, because I guess it was my outlet too for dealing with the intense change that was upon me, and that was about to come. And this poem is called Good For You, Jean de Saint-Andrieu, and I'm not going to get into the title. It's multidimensional, and in the end it's meaningless. But suffice to say, a period in my life where I spent a lot of time working on the telephone as a telephone operator, as a banker, as a insurance recruiter, and things like this, working for an illegal telemarketing company, all that kind of stuff. And you would just come into people who have cool names, funny names, whatever. And this guy had a cool name, Jean de Saint-Andrieu. That's what he, I am Jean de Saint-Andrieu. He's like, wow, that's a cool name, dude. So anyway, I thought, well, yeah. So I remembered it and I wrote it down, and that's kind of how these poems began to be written. I would just find something like some guy with a cool name, or I would read something in a magazine, or I would see something written on on a wall even, or something like that. Real literally, I mean, I've done this. And I just collected these things, and I would put them in a book. I had this book of John Ashbery's writings of when he did art writing for the art news and stuff, and I'd put these little slips of paper in his book, and then they would kind of marinate in there for a period of time. And then one day I would say it's time to write a poem, and I would pull these out, and that's how the poem would be written. It wasn't like I was sitting there with a quill pen and struck by a lightning bolt of inspiration one moment and we just started writing. It would sometimes take weeks, if not months, to accumulate all this stuff. And they were disparate things too, just like being in a desert. When you go out into the desert, you see, you might see a 54 rusted automobile. I remember going out to the desert, and you would see wild burros walking across the highway. You would see Mustangs. You would see, one day I saw a clown driving a motorcycle. One day I saw a samoyed, if you know what those guys are. There's like, I think, Persian guys who, with swords and stuff, just walking down a thing, I mean, so there was shoes. I mean, there's disparate things but they were all in the context of being in a desert. So in the context of being a poem, and you could have disparate things also, all things fit. As Pound used to say, that's a rag bag. You just keep stuffing stuff in there till it's all filled up. That's kind of what I was doing, so that's how the poem was getting written. And that's how the poems were written for a long time. And even to a point, I think today I still use the basic writing down things, schnibbles of things, and collecting them and then putting them into a poem. That's where you find your inspiration. Like a chef, I guess, would go out in the morning to the market and look for ingredients. I go out looking for stuff, like a beachcomber on a beach, or going rummaging, that kind of stuff. And that's how the poems get written. And sometimes it's just pure sitting down with a pen and just writing it all, but it doesn't really happen very much anymore. It's usually pieces of paper and time and vocabulary, words that attract me and stuff like that. Women's butts or something like that. Sorry. So anyway, this poem is called Good for You, Jean de Saint-Anjou. Begins with a child's basic, simple observations of one's environment, and it goes off into many wonderful things. Thanks for putting up with my meandering. Good for you, Jean de Saint-Anjou. That's a cactus. That's a flower, huh? The desert in sanzen. But what does it mean in dreams to have my ear cut off, or to be wearing no pants? In waking hours, to go into a grocery store and see something called chocolate-covered ernies. The mallow and dodder accept our names like andolinos and the coreleones, or even Szep to Zepp. There is no mysticism in a desert. It's zen. The lizard scrapes along the orange rock, giant to me from yards away. The white skylark rental, the full moon of April, the sacred datura opens its ajna, or yoni, while burros, the Buddhas of the Mojave, nosh on the lush of the moonlight. My friends in Pittsburgh worry, like those who said adieu, crossing the Bering Strait or left Japan and landed in Peru in 3000 BC, were Jews saying fuck off to the Romans during the 1st century, finding refuge in the Tennessee Valley. Or Leif Erikson, more precisely Hui San, a Chinese Buddhist who reached the West Coast 900 years before Columbus. And for what benefits did he risk a Pacific voyage? Not for cardamom, cumin, or rubies. Rebelling against the rigors, meditating with rocks in his head, or the paroxysm of scripture. Be concerned that I may grow porcine from too much Mexican cuisine, not having seen the flower of the Fusong tree, how could I forget?